All right, hello and welcome to the heart. So today we're going to be talking about heart anatomy, as well as how signals are conducted in the heart, and then some of the factors that influence muscle contractions in the heart. So hope you're ready. It's going to be kind of fun. All right, I'm going to hide me so you can actually see these a little bit better. All right, so the anatomy of the heart. So we find the heart in a region of the chest cavity called the mediastinum. Okay, so basically, I think you know in the chest cavity you have your two lungs and the heart is sort of in between them. That technical area is also occupied by some blood vessels, which you can kind of see in this image. There's some blood vessels, your esophagus, your aorta, and basically that's the mediastinum. So here's a definition. So it goes from the sternum, so anteriorly the sternum, to the vertebral column going posteriorly or deep, from the first rib to the diaphragm, all of that is the mediastinum, and that area between the heart. Okay, so that's where we find the heart. That's the technical name for that region. Now, one of the cool things about the heart is it has a very tough covering called the pericardium. Okay, you can see this, it's the membrane surrounding and protecting the heart, right? And its job, again, it's made to help protect the heart. It helps confine it, so it keeps it from like overstretching. Plus, it's going to help anchor the heart, so your heart doesn't just bounce all over the place in the chest cavity. That'd be terrible. And we'll see a couple of other things in the next slide too. So, all right. So here we have different parts to this pericardium. The first part and the vast majority of it, like the kind of the bulk of it, is something called the fibrous pericardium. It's tough, it's inelastic, and it's dense, irregular connective tissue. I'm not sure whether or not in lab our hearts will have this. Sometimes we get them, they do, sometimes they don't. If we do, they're going to this fibrous pericardium is going to really remind you of that dura mater. Kind of the setup is reminiscent of that. So again, this fibrous pericardium, very tough. It's meant to keep the heart from overstretching. Again, provides protection as well as helps anchor that heart. Then we have what's known as the serous pericardium. This is much thinner, and it has two layers. So lining the inside of that fibrous pericardium, we're going to have something called the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. And then lining the surface of the heart itself, we'll have something called the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, and what you'll probably hear me call it a lot is the epicardium. Okay. So again, this serous pericardium is two layers, and there's a little space in between that has something called pericardial fluid in it. Okay, and that pericardial fluid is very slippery, it's very slick, and it's meant to allow the heart to beat and move around in the chest cavity without actually sticking to something. Because as soon as you have muscle sticking, it's going to start ripping, and the last thing you need is your heart falling apart on you. It's got to last, well, like your entire lifetime, hopefully. Right? So when we talk about the layers of the heart itself, we often start with that epicardium, so again, that visceral layer, so right on the surface. And then the actual muscles of the heart are called myocardium. So myo meaning muscle, and then cardium referring to the heart. So about 95% of the muscle of the heart is actually this myocardium, is muscle. Okay, and then very similarly, we have an outer lining, we're going to have an inner lining. And now that inner lining, and you can kind of see on this image, is called the endocardium. It's nice and smooth. Again, it kind of helps keep blood flowing nice and smooth, and helps protect actually these muscle cells as well. And this endocardium will be continuous with the blood vessels of the body as well. All right, let's just take a quick look at some of the external anatomy of the heart. You'll be covering the majority of this in lab. But some of the things that we'll see right away, kind of start here, they put in nice big bold letters, is a right auricle of the right atrium. So those auricles are going to be there to help provide extra volume to the atria, particularly when the heart is beating a little bit more vigorously, kind of like during exercise when you've got more blood flowing back to the heart. That atrium kind of acts as a pressure reservoir, so you can get more blood coming back to the atrium without like kind of putting a big pressure load on it. Let's see, we'll also see the superior vena cava coming in from the top. That superior vena cava is going to be draining blood from the head, neck, arm area, returning that deoxygenated blood back to the heart. From the bottom, we have the inferior vena cava, bringing blood back from the legs and the abdominal cavity back to the heart. Let's see what else we see. Here we have our right ventricle on this side. You'll see also in big bold letters, we have the coronary sulcus. And remember, the coronary sulcus is the groove, and then that coronary artery sits in the sulcus. And oftentimes, as you're kind of seeing in this image, there's some fat in that sulcus. Okay. On this side, as you're kind of moving toward our right, the heart's left, right? Remember, proper anatomical position. We see the pulmonary trunk, the ascending aorta, a couple of other blood vessels, and we'll get to those next chapter. We'll see there's also an auricle on the left-hand side, some veins. We'll see the anterior interventricular sulcus, which also has the branch of that coronary artery with the same name. And one of the things you might be noticing as you're kind of just looking at blood vessels, like the aorta is nice and red. This pulmonary trunk is blue. This artery is blue. So why are these arteries are red? What gives? Why do we have these different colors? Well, it's all about oxygenation levels. Hopefully my pen will be cooperative with me. All right. So we have a few technical definitions for artery and vein. Well, not a few, just one for each, I guess. So an artery, right? An artery is going to be a blood vessel, I'm just going to abbreviate BV, a blood vessel that takes blood away from the heart. Okay. All right, and so a vein then, and let's see if I can get my pen to write again. So a vein is simply a blood vessel that takes blood toward the heart. Okay, so in this case, on the right side of the heart, all of these blood vessels, so the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, are bringing back deoxygenated blood from the body. So what will end up happening is blood will flow through the different chambers of the heart, and then it'll be taking through this pulmonary trunk, which is an artery, through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. So in this case, the blood is still deoxygenated, right? It'll go to the lungs, pick up oxygen, and then come back via veins, these pulmonary veins from either lung. And at that point, the blood is oxygenated, so they're red. So please make sure you keep a mental note of this. It kind of trips people up, particularly in lab during a practical, that the colors are reversed when we're talking about blood going toward the lungs and then back from the lungs toward the heart. Okay. All right. So don't get tripped up. And let's see if I can get the slide to advance. All right, let's talk about the internal anatomy of the heart. So we already started a little bit on this. Right, so again, we'll have blood coming toward the heart from the neck, arms, via the superior vena cava. We'll have blood coming from the legs, the abdominal cavity, from the inferior vena cava. We'll have some blood coming from the coronary sinus. That'll be blood coming from the heart itself. And basically all of that's going to connect, all that blood, I should say, collects in the right atrium, right? So all that blood comes in here, and then after the right atrium, it basically flows through this valve, that's called the tricuspid valve, and then into the right ventricle. Okay? Let's just talk about a couple of things here that we just briefly touched upon. The right atrium has something called the fossa ovalis in it. It's a little indent. When you were a little fetus, you basically had a hole in the heart there that was called the foramen ovale. So the fossa ovalis in the fetal heart is called the foramen ovale. And there's an actual hole in the heart that would take blood between the two different sides of the heart. We'll talk a little bit more about fetal blood circulation later, but just keep that in mind, okay? After that, we had, again, this coronary sinus, which is bringing blood back from the heart itself. We have this tricuspid valve, And it's called tricuspid because it has sort of 3 flaps to it. And this tricuspid valve is going to be very important. It's there to make sure that when the ventricle, so this chamber, when the ventricle contracts, blood doesn't accidentally kind of blurp back up into the atria. You don't want that to happen. You want all of the blood to basically go out this pulmonary trunk into the lungs. Okay, and again, we'll have another set of valves here on that pulmonary trunk. These are called the pulmonary valves or the pulmonary semilunar valves. Is what you'll hear them called in lab. And again, they're going to prevent the blood from kind of flowing backwards back into the ventricle. All right, so again, blood's going to come into the right atrium, pass a tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, and then from the right ventricle, it's going to leave the heart via the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries, set of left and then right, that will go to the lungs. Okay, and in the lungs, it'll pick up oxygen. All right, and then coming back from the lungs, it's going to come back via these pulmonary veins, again from both sides. Again, it'll collect in the atria. It will pass through what's known as, this time, the bicuspid valve, or sometimes you'll see the term mitral valve. It's called bicuspid because it only has 2 flaps, I should say. And then mitral, it gets its name because they thought it looked like a bishop's mitre, kind of a hat, okay, that certain Catholic priests wore. Anyway, goes past that valve into the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle, it will go out the aorta to the rest of the body. And again, on the left side, we're talking about oxygenated blood. And now a couple of other things that I'd like to talk about. So attached to the atrioventricular valves, so the atrioventricular valves are the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve. So the atrioventricular valves, it's another name for them, atrioventricular valves. Okay, again, so the left one is simply going to be the bicuspid on the left side. The right one is simply the tricuspid. Okay, atrioventricular valves, they have something attached to them called the chordae tendinae. Okay, the chordae tendinae. Basically, they're these tendinous cords. And the important thing about these cords is they're going to attach to another thing called the papillary muscle. Okay, and the chordae tendinae attached to something called a papillary muscle. In the ventricle. Okay, so what ends up happening is when the ventricles contract, that blood, kind of in the force, the pressure I should say, pushes back on the valves, forcing them shut. Now, the chordae tendinae are going to hold those valves closed, and the papillary muscles are going to pull on the chordae tendinae, basically making sure that the valves don't kind of flap open back into the atria. Does that kind of make sense? So it's almost like, imagine like you flying a kite and you get a big gust of wind. So you would be like the papillary muscle pulling down on the string, making sure that the kite or the valve doesn't like just, go in the wrong direction. Okay. The other structure you might see, and you will talk about in lab, is something called the trabeculate carnae. Now, the trabeculate carnae are sort of these ridge-like muscles, or like this, I should say, the ridge-like surface of the inside of the ventricles. And basically what that is, there are specific conduction system pathways in the actual heart muscle itself, and that's what you're seeing there. It's just raised areas where signals are being conducted through the heart. Okay, and then sort of last but not least, I'll just touch on this. There's something called the ligamentum arteriosum, and you'll see this in lab as well. There's sort of this little white ligament that goes between the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. That ligamentum arteriosum was once a blood vessel as well. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about fetal circulation. However, back up. And again, similar to that foramen ovale in the fetal heart, the job of this back when you were a fetus was to bypass the lungs. Because again, you don't want to send a lot of oxygenated blood deoxygenated blood to the lungs when they're non-functioning, right? The fetus isn't actually breathing using its lungs. It's getting all of its oxygen and nutrients via the placenta. So the heart had a couple of different bypasses to bypass the lungs, so the blood would just simply go back into circulation. Okay. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to fetal blood circulation. All right, so just a couple of things just to bring to your attention here. So you can kind of see it's a transverse section through the heart, and you'll notice that the walls of the right ventricle are much thinner than the walls of the left ventricle. Now I'm going to give you guys a second. Why do you think that is? Why does the left ventricle need such thick walls versus why does the right ventricle can get away with such thin little walls? What does it mean to have thick walls? What are you able to do? Well, I think naturally, I think we all know, right? The bigger the muscle, the stronger it is, right? So what does the right side of the heart do, right? It's pumping blood to the lungs. Well, the lungs, if you remember back to that picture at the mediastinum, the lungs are right there. It doesn't have to be very strong. And you probably don't even want it to be that strong because you don't want to blow out your lungs, right? So the right ventricle can be thinner, whereas the left ventricle has the job of getting blood all the way up to the top of your head, down to your toes, out to your fingertips. So it has to be much stronger to get blood much further away. So that's why it's that much thicker. Kind of neat, right? There is a sort of skeleton. Now, it's not a bony skeleton. It's basically a connective tissue skeleton. Okay, it helps act as a point of insertion for the muscles of the heart and acts as an electric insulator between the atria and ventricles. So what that means and why that's important is you want to make sure, and I'll kind of bring me back, I don't know, I feel like you need to see me doing hand actions. Why that's important is when you really want to make sure that the signals in the heart are being conducted in a very orderly fashion. So, and we'll see this in a little bit too. So signals will start up here on the top. They're basically going to cascade down the heart, down to the bottom, kind of down to the bottom, and then back up. So what that ends up happening is you're going to have contraction of the atria, which makes sense because you want to have squeeze all that blood into the ventricles below. And then you want the ventricles, however, to contract from the bottom up because you want to like tube of toothpaste, you want to squeeze it out. If you kind of squeeze in the middle, you're not getting all the blood or toothpaste out, I guess. So again, by having this fibrous skeleton, you're insulating it so signal doesn't go everywhere. You're directing it to a very specific point so you can get a very specific type of muscle contraction. Yay. All right. So here's just an image of the bicuspid valve. So you can kind of see again when blood's flowing through it, it's open. And then when the ventricles contract, the pressure closes the valves, and then the chordae tendineae are going to pull on the valves to make sure that it's staying closed, right? And they're being pulled on by that papillary muscle. And here's just another image. So this is a superior view, and you can see they remove the atria. And what you're seeing here is the pulmonary valves and the aortic semilunar valves are open. So basically the ventricles at this point are contracting. And so when the ventricles are contracting, these are open, these are closed, preventing that spilling back into the atria. And they kind of alternate on off. Oops. Right. And this is just what we talked about as well. So this is just a flow of blood throughout the body. So again, a lot of times we start here in the right atrium. Again, it's deoxygenated. It flows through that tricuspid valve into that right ventricle, through that pulmonary semilunar valve, into the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries, goes to the lungs, picks up oxygen, gives off the carbon dioxide, comes back toward the heart via pulmonary veins, and again, in this case now they're red because they're oxygenated, into the left atrium, past the bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle, out past the aortic valve, out through the aorta, into the arteries. And then this is kind of key point here. So basically it's going to be at the site of capillaries where blood is going to lose the oxygen and gain carbon dioxide. It's really in the capillaries where you have gas and nutrient exchange. Okay, it doesn't occur at these larger areas, these higher up sort of blood vessels. They're too large for it to happen. You need to go down to capillaries. So it goes to capillaries, and then basically the blood vessels come together, and then as we mentioned earlier, blood will come back via the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, coronary sinus, back into that right atrium. So that's kind of nice, right? So it's just what we talked about. So sometimes people will get the tricuspid and bicuspid valve mixed up. This is what I always tell people. Like, again, I always start here on the right atrium and I kind of go around. So if we do that, you have to go through the tricuspid valve before you go through the bicuspid valve, right? So you have to try it before you buy it, right? It's kind of a nice little way to think about it. Try it before you buy it. Hopefully that helps. All right, so coronary circulation. Now, interestingly, the blood that is actually in the atrium and ventricles, the heart can't use that to nourish itself. It has to have these coronary blood vessels to feed the actual myocardium or the muscles of the heart. And you'll have seen a lot of these in lab, or you will be seeing them. So let's just go over some of the main ones. So on this side here, we have our arteries. Excuse me, on this image, we have veins. And this is, they kind of do a little bit better job here on the veins. You can kind of see the ones that are more dark are in the anterior position, and then kind of more faded are in the posterior position. I have a kind of same here with the arteries, anterior, and then like these are a little bit lighter, kind of more pinkish, are in the posterior. All right, so one nice thing that they do, so here we have our aorta, our ascending aorta and the aortic arch, and right here you can see there's a right coronary artery, and then there's a left coronary artery. Often in lab, it's kind of hard to see them on the models because other structures are obscuring them. So that right coronary artery comes around the right margin, forms that marginal branch, and it'll continue around toward the back into that posterior interventricular branch. Okay. And then the left coronary artery comes, branches off the aorta from this side. It splits down the front into that anterior interventricular branch, and then it continues around toward the back, called the circumflex branch. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And then as far as the veins go, kind of going next to, or yeah, I guess it's pretty much right alongside that anterior interventricular branch is the great cardiac vein. So they kind of are found right next to one another. And you'll see the great cardiac vein goes around the back. And right here it gets a little bit larger. They call that the coronary sinus. And that's what's going to open up into that right atrium. And then coming along this side toward the back, we get our middle cardiac vein. All right, so down the back, we have middle cardiac vein. In the back artery, you have posterior interventricular branch. In the front, you have an anterior interventricular branch. For the artery, you have a great cardiac vein. In the back, you have a coronary sinus. And then as far as the arteries go, you have a marginal branch here on the right side, and then the circumflex branch on the left side. All right. And we will stop there for now, because now we're going to get into the electrical signals of the heart. So so this bit has been the anatomy part. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask. All right? See you next time.